why will fucking better save the planet?
as a tagline. Yeah. I mean, honestly, I came to this reluctantly and backwards. Yeah. So for you, right, you've put your stake in the ground around Tantra and that culture and that community. For me, it was much more just taking a clear-eyed look at the evidence and the research of how do we heal and grow? How do we mend and integrate trauma? And how do we prompt and integrate, like precipitate and integrate healthy and productive peak states?
Yeah.
And the more I looked into the research, and my background was in flow states and sort of extreme leadership. So everything from the athletes of Red Bull to advising SEAL Team 6 and the U.S. Naval War College, and sort of how do people do things in really intense, high consequence situations and conditions. And the more I kept studying the research and the findings, it was like, oh, if you really pursue, human optimization to its logical conclusion, and you don't flinch or are squeamish, right? You end up in one of two places. You end up in sort of super sexy biohacking or really nerdy kink. And I was just like, oh my God, really?
And they both go together. It doesn't have to be one or the other.
Yeah. And you're like, holy shit, like this is the human physiological nervous system. We are prefrontal cortexes connected to spinal columns, connected to opposable thumbs and erogenous zones. That's us.
Yeah.
Right. And if you just go where the nerve endings dictate and suggest, you end up realizing that our entire bedrock, ecstatic neural circuitry is maps one-to-one with our sexual arousal network. And John Lilly, the sort of famous and infamous researcher, the inventor of float tanks, the pioneer who, LSD with dolphins, all of that guy. Right?
Yeah. He jerked off the dolphins with government money, right? While they were high.
Technically, I think he had a nurse do that. They kept the whole gender alignment thing square, But yes, I think there was a...
You wouldn't want to have a gay dolphin experience on government money. It has to be a heterosexual dolphin experience.
No gay tripping dolphins. That would be a bridge too far.
The line. Yeah. We definitely won't fund sexuality research in this company, but we will let the dolphin get jacked off.
Yeah. And apparently he was happier for it. But that was his original finding with not dolphins but with rhesus monkeys. Was he's like, oh, in a primate nervous system, and this was when he was pioneering these really early electrode stimulations through steel sleeves in the skulls, kind of the stuff that's a little creepy and doesn't pass animal rights and IRBs these days. But back then he was like, oh my goodness. Fundamentally a male monkey with a chance to be stimulated to orgasm will do that, 14 hours a day, pass out, sleep, wake up, and self-stimulate all over again.
Yeah.
But what he realized, it was sort of, scandalous, titillating, but it was like, oh, of course it makes sense. Look, evolution has to get us to reproduce.
Yeah.
And for hundreds of thousands of years, and arguably, hundreds of millions of years for the rest of the, vertebrates and mammals even, we had to figure it out with zero instruction manual, which meant that evolution through the kitchen sink, right, at incenting us through our neurochemistry, through our hormones, through interactions, to figure out how to put our bits together to make more of us, or none of us would be here.
Yeah.
So you're like, that's pretty powerful. Mm-hmm. And then you start looking at that, and you're like, okay, if that's our hardwiring and all other peak states, all other ecstatic states, all of these things sort of stem from that foundation, you're like, all right, that's data point one. Data point two, let's take a look at human sexuality. And you're like, oh man, it's just a misery Olympics. Like everything from Helen and the face that launched 1,000 ships in the War of Troy and all that carnage and destruction, to all of our own lives, to infidelities, to jealousies, to abortions, to miscarriages, to sexual violence, to childhood abuse, to you name it. And you're like, oh my God, how much of sadness and suffering all the way to war and conflict in the world at its root has a sexual impetus or driver? And you're like, a whole lot, a whole lot. I mean, even that stat that, there's genetic analysis that shows that 8% of Asian men carry Genghis Khan's DNA.
Totally.
Which is just war and rape.
Yeah.
You're like, oh my God, this is gut churning. And so you're like, wait, if so much of our suffering is based on this fundamental, deep structure of our evolutionary impulses that we're encoded to on a biological level, and it sort of feels like biology is destiny, but destiny is a whole lot of heartache and heartbreak and trauma. That doesn't feel like it's super tenable. So what if understanding what those really deep drivers are can then liberate us to snip the puppet strings of evolution, right? And learn to stand up and dance for ourselves. And along the way, oh, by the way, that stuff that's so super potent, super powerful, so strongly incentive, but often leading to tragedy, can actually be what we can hotwire evolution, right? Reclaim our agency, and then repurpose all of those things towards healing, integration, connection, and mystery. And then that's what, a lot of the Kinsey Institute researchers and a lot of the other contemporary science, which is super cool, right, is now coming in to validate and explain there are actually ways to do that. That's not just a thought experiment. And in fact, given the state of the world, given the fact that, we have 8 billion humans on an increasingly sketchy planet with the potential for accelerating heartache, heartbreak, stress, trauma, existential dread, fill in the blanks, how do we get that kind of healing to as many people around the world as possible? And you're like, okay, well, it needs to be cheap or, cheap or free, right? It needs to be hard to suppress, and it needs to be simple and self-rewarding to do, right? And so that's where you kind of get to like, how, like you can do, oh my gosh, look, there's transcranial magnetic stimulation. That's neat, but it requires a $10 million machine, and it's $500 a pop or $5,000, complex, even psychedelic therapies, right? You have to sign up for a study. You have to wait. Do you get co-pays or not? All of these kind of things. You're like, well, wait, breathing, we all have to do. And that too, if we fuck that one up, we die. So it's got really strong incentives as to just our respiratory drives and its impact on our consciousness based on the gas blends in our bloodstream and brain. And you got sexuality, right? And then you've also got some versions of embodiment, like what's happening in our vagus nerve, what's happening in our endocannabinoid system, what's happening in these things. And you realize, Archimedes, or not even, it is Archimedes, give me a lever long enough, right? And a fulcrum upon which to place it, and I can move the world. So the longest lever for us to figure out scalable healing, inspiration, and connection for all of humanity is the stuff that's closest to our root evolutionary drivers: sexuality, respiration, and embodiment. So let's start there. And so that's what I mean about kind of coming into this ass backwards. Right? I mean, I'm anything but a tantra teacher, anything but a sexologist. It was coming at it from the sort of anthropological side and the performance neuroscience side, and just realizing it sure seems like there's a there. And I was like, why on earth am I going to like risk my career writing about this? Because my wife was like, don't tell anyone. Like, you're crazy. Just shut up. Just keep this to yourself. And I'm like, okay. And I did. I would for like 3 months. And then 6 months later, I'm like, I think I actually have to take a crack at this, because we need the open source toolkit. Yeah. And everybody needs it. Yeah. And we have to figure out ways to get, like, if the hour wasn't so late and the stakes weren't so high, I would have happily stuck to my knitting and never said a word. Yeah. But given that it feels like this is kind of the calm before a whole bunch of storms. Yeah. I was like, I think this sort of, these Lego blocks need to be out in the world, and what people build with them after they've, learned about them is on all of us. But I felt some sort of ethical commitment to at least take a crack at it. Yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. Thank you so much, because it is brave still, strangely, to talk about these things. And it's interesting in Recapture the Rapture, you talk about the anarchist cookbook being like the original manual of like being able to like blow shit up and like start the revolution. And like I read that when I was a teenager, and I was like, yeah, and would run around in Oakland dressed in all black being an anarchist. And then at a certain point I was like, wait, I was like the world we're creating is a function of the consciousness inside of us, like that it's an expression of our internal consciousness. And so if we manage somehow to, I don't know, overthrow the Bush administration with all this anger and rage inside of us, all we're going to create is a new world order of anger and rage. So if I really want to see a different planet, what would shift consciousness the fastest? And I came to sexuality in two ways. One was actually very thoughtful. I was at Stanford University, and I was like, that seems like the superhighway to people's transformation. That seems where there's the most conscious misinformation and social repression, and also the most access to growth and revelation and power for people. And also because I was sexually abused by my father, I had this sense of like what it felt like to have sexual sovereignty and wholeness like ripped from me. And I had the kind of righteous indignation that I think sometimes only teenagers can have when they're fresh to the world, where I was like, why the fuck is there not a sexual healing center on every street corner of every city? Like, what are we spending our money on if not the restoration of our own wholeness and healing, especially in these areas? And so at Stanford, I actually worked on high school sex education because I was like, I want to put the revolution back in the hands of like the kids and the teenagers and like teach them what sex really is. And eventually I just gave up in academia back then. And I was like, fuck it, I'm going to run off to the jungle. I literally bought a one-way ticket to Thailand and I was like, I'm going to go find out what like sex really is. And what was so fascinating for me in reading your book is there's this incredible science that you talk about in there where, you know, people doing sexual practices are showing better results, you know, than people taking psilocybin at Johns Hopkins University, that there's 6% more people are having, if I'm quoting this correctly, mystical experiences from having a clitoral orgasm than even from taking magic mushrooms, right? Psilocybin. And I see this every day, right? Because as soon as I started working on tantric sexuality, on sacred sexuality, I was like, whoa, like I started this so people could have these like expanded states of orgasm and bliss and beauty. And because I knew what had been taken from me in my experiences, in my journey of restoring that, I was like, I want everyone to know how to do this, whether they've been abused or not. And then in literally, you know, tens of thousands of paying clients and millions of people that have been impacted with my work, I was like, holy shit, like the results people get from doing this work. And it's not just because of me, anyone doing this work, right? Anyone holding it with a fair degree of integrity and safety and training would be able to support people to get these results. And I was like, if you could make this a pharmaceutical pill, it would be a multi-billion-dollar pill, right? The same with breath work. Like if you just take a pill that gave you what breath work does, it would be multi-billion-dollar industry. And even for me, it's practically illegal, right? Like I can't run ads about it on Meta. Like I can't even talk about it that publicly, right? Because it's like, oh, if you put a stone up your vagina, all of a sudden, like, fuck, we still can't talk about it, right? Like even cock being sacred, like it's still such a huge leap for people to be able to talk about the power of sex and what sex can really do for us and the transformation that's available to people. Like I see it day in and day out, and I love, and this was so beautiful in your book, and I literally cried when it's still gonna bring tears in my eyes, like reading those sections, because it's gonna help people to actually see what sex actually is and like what it can really do and how it really is a portal to mystical states of consciousness and how it does restore our nervous systems to this. To me, it's like the base of your nervous system, your fourth brain, maybe even your first brain. And when you're all repressed and shut down, like what are you doing to the whole foundation of your nervous system? When it's activated and alive and pumping, it's like your whole system starts to integrate in this way that I'm sure there's science behind it somewhere, or there will be soon. It's like your vagus nerve starts coming back into its power, and what that can do for your body, your soul, your spirituality, it's mind-blowing.